Hey guys, welcome back to my I definitely didn't skip several weeks of this again reviews of Yu-Gi-Oh! Okay, fine. I apologize, my schedule's been weird the last couple of weeks. That's why you haven't seen any Star vs. the Force of Evil reviews this week yet, by the way. You'll be getting those Friday and Saturday, probably. Point being, I'm back, and I do intend to continue doing these as often as possible. I might even try to get a second one out this week if I can. Today we are looking at the Shadi arc from the original run of the Yu-Gi-Oh! Manga. Surprisingly, Kazuki Takahashi doesn't take 7 or 8 volumes to expand upon this plot point, as he might have done later on. At the end of the previous chapter, we saw Shadi mention a second criminal, someone else who had violated the Valley of the Kings, who he needs to go and judge in the same manner that he did the museum curator. He's obviously talking about Sugoroku's professor friend. And so when we see the title of the next chapter, The Other Criminal, we know immediately that some confrontation is going to come between the professor and Shadi. Though I am going to gloss over this chapter a little bit, because I do intend to cover this chapter and Shadi's duel with the other Yugi in this review. So I want to get through this part as quickly as possible, so it feels like I'm rushing. I am. I do want to point out, though, that we do see here Yugi contemplating what Shadi meant by another him inside the Millennium Puzzle. It's cool to see Yugi acknowledging something to do with the other Yugi, and it's cool to see the plot acknowledging that they're not the same person for pretty much the first time. Though this is where my issue with Shadi in these chapters comes from, aside from any potential moral stuff. From a pure writing perspective, yes, I know a whole bunch of stuff gets retconned later on in this story, but that doesn't mean that it was retconned well. The retcons make Shadi into a character who I do not buy for a second wouldn't have realized who the other Yugi was when he met him. I've been avoiding talking about who the other Yugi actually is as much as possible so as not to spoil stuff later on. The identity of the other Yugi is the one big twist that Yu-Gi-Oh! Has. Yeah, there are little ones here and there, but that's the one big one. So for the sake of anyone who doesn't know Yu-Gi-Oh! Who might be watching these reviews for some reason and actually cares about the story, I've been avoiding talking about specifics regarding the other Yugi. I can't address my problem with Shadi here and continue to do that. I apologize. So I have to give a minor spoiler warning for future stuff. The other Yugi is an ancient Egyptian pharaoh. He is the spirit of that ancient Egyptian pharaoh sealed away in the Millennium Puzzle. We later learn that Shadi is the keeper of the Millennium items and has knowledge of the Millennium Puzzle, what it is, and what it's meant to do. And we learn later in the movie Dark Side of Dimensions, which is canon to the manga continuity, as well as everything that it shares with the anime continuity, that Shadi had knowledge of this pharaoh, that he had an entire plan hinging on the life of this pharaoh, I guess you would call it the second life of this pharaoh in modern times. And based on the timeline of it, it's not something that he could have set up after this event, here in these chapters of the manga. The timeline just doesn't make any sense if he did. The moment that Shadi realized there was a second person in the heart of the person who bears the Millennium Puzzle, he should have realized who that second person is. There's no way that he wouldn't have. And so as much as I do enjoy this introduction to Shadi as a character and the following confrontation between him and the other Yugi, my enjoyment of it, looking back, is colored a lot based on what I learned later on. As much as I enjoy these early volumes of the Yu-Gi-Oh! Manga, that seems to be a recurring theme. Breaking these down and really analyzing them, it's kind of starting to bum me out. Moving on though, Sugoroku learns what happened to the museum curator. He tells Yugi about it, and he mentions that he is worried about Professor Yoshimori because it seems like this death of the museum curator, whatever happened to him, was connected to the dig. It's a bit of a leap to think that, but we do learn some stuff about Sugoroku later that makes it clear why he would make that leap. It's pretty interesting. I wonder if Takahashi already had some idea of what Sugoroku's backstory was going to turn out to be at this point in the story. Yugi at this point remembers what Shadi said and starts to become worried as well. So when Sugoroku says that he wants to go and meet up with Professor Yoshimori at his lab, Yugi wants to come along. Anzu and Jinochi just happened to have seen the news as well, met up independently at a third site, and then came to talk to Yugi about the news at the same time that he was leaving so that they could bump into him and go with him and Sugoroku. Okay, so it doesn't make a ton of sense that Anzu and Jinochi are here right now at this exact moment, but it happens, and they end up going too. Unfortunately, they don't reach Professor Yoshimori's lab before Shadi does. And even though I'm sure Professor Yoshimori's heart would not be weighed heavier than a feather, Shadi seems intent on killing him one way or the other. He talks about putting the professor on trial, but then effectively passes a death sentence when he says that he will look into the room within Professor Yoshimori's soul before killing him. Because he does confront Professor Yoshimori indirectly, unlike the museum curator who he confronted very directly, he doesn't alert Professor Yoshimori to his presence. He's able to go into the room within Professor Yoshimori's soul, does a little bit of a character analysis of him, points out his obsession with the past, tied to his love of ancient artifacts and archaeology and books on archaeology. He points out pictures of Professor Yoshimori's family in a dusty corner, suggesting that he's left them behind to pursue his career. And he points out that the room is very dark, suggesting that Yoshimori is afraid, probably because of what happened to the museum curator, but that there is a light of hope, and Shadi sees that it's Sugoroku and Yugi who Professor Yoshimori knows is coming. This is when Shadi comes up with a plan. The Millennium Key doesn't just give him the ability to look into people's souls, it gives him the ability to reprogram them for specific sets of behavior by rearranging what's inside those rooms. It's a very crude and very temporary kind of mind control, far more limited than the examples of mind control that we see later on in this narrative. Shadi decides that he's going to turn Professor Yoshimori into a puppet and use him to lure Yugi into a game. He already lost to the other Yugi on the other Yugi's terms. Now he wants to set the terms and see just how powerful and resourceful this person is. The group arrives and Professor Yoshimori immediately attacks Jinochi. He doesn't care about anything else, so getting him off of Jinochi is almost impossible. Shadi appears and announces that he's doing this because he has a theory that this will bring out the other Yugi. How he would know this, I have no idea, but whatever. This brings us immediately into the next chapter, Shadi's challenge. We get a bit of a recap of what happened in the last chapter. Shadi briefly explains his plan, but before the other Yugi can come out, it's actually Anzu who manages to get Yoshimori off of Jinochi. So Shadi, realizing that this isn't enough motivation for the other Yugi to emerge, decides to go into the mind of someone else, someone more important to Yugi. He enters Anzu's mind and we get a similar character analysis of her. We see an image of a faceless man that represents her infatuation with the other Yugi, an image representing her dream of becoming a dancer in America. The entire room, in fact, is designed like a dance studio. Shadi seems remorseful about what he's about to do. He says that Anzu is a girl who's easy to like, but he restructures her room anyway. She becomes a second puppet, and while Jinochi leads the puppet Yoshimori away, Shadi confronts Yugi with the puppet Anzu. This is finally enough to bring the other Yugi forth, and he is pissed. Shadi, however, is not shaken and challenges the other Yugi to a shadow game. The other Yugi accepts, and Shadi takes 10 minutes to assemble the game. Yugi contemplates a little bit about Shadi and what his motives might be. It's stuff that's never really dealt with later on, so I'm not going to really talk about it here. What's important is that he decides he must treat Shadi as an enemy, regardless of what his other feelings about the man might be. 10 minutes up, he goes to the roof of the building where Shadi said he would host the game, and we get to see what shape the game has taken. Shadi has constructed a sort of gangplank and placed Anzu upon it. The gangplank is secured by 4 Shabti, which are basically small clay statues. The Millennium Key is hanging from the same 4 ropes and is secured to the same fence as the rest of the Shabti by a 5th. What Shadi has done, and this is actually a really interesting game, what Shadi's done here is he's used the shadow powers to tie the 4 Shabti securing the gangplank to Yugi's will. He gives a big spiel about the power of the Millennium Puzzle and says that he knows that somewhere deep down Yugi is afraid of that power. He explains that fear is the weakness in Yugi's heart, and that the more that weakness is exposed during the course of their game, the weaker the Shabti holding Anzu up will become. If all 4 of them break, the gangplank will fall. Anzu will die. But if Yugi can rattle Shadi enough that the 5th Shabti, the one securing the Millennium Key, breaks, it will slide freely down the other ropes securing the gangplank and touch Anzu's hand. This will undo the marionette redesign, turning Anzu back into herself, and she'll be able to save herself from falling. It's all very visually dynamic, especially when we see that Yugi's already shaken enough that one of his Shabti breaks, and therefore one of the ropes securing the gangplank falls free. So the other Yugi recollects himself. He now only has 3 chances left. If he fails again, Anzu's life becomes that much more at risk, and he can't allow that to happen. The other Yugi proceeds to fight Shadi in a series of games that are made real by the shadows, the same way that the other Yugi has done with games in the past. The first is a riddle given physical form. It's very interesting. It's a bunch of clinging zombies coming out of the ground. The riddle is what creeps on the ground and clings to the pillars. The other Yugi is so shaken by the image of it that one of his 3 remaining Shabti begins to break. This is one of the same sorts of illusions that Yugi uses on his opponents all the time. But because in this instance, the fear in Yugi's heart is making his heart weaker than Shadi's, he's being overcome by the same kind of illusion that usually he'd be immune to. But the other Yugi has an iron will. That is something that's consistent throughout all parts of the Yu-Gi-Oh! Franchise that he's involved in. So he's able to calm himself down, keep himself from rushing to a conclusion, and come up with the answer. The pillar in the riddle is himself, therefore the answer is his shadow. The illusion disappears, but the next stage of the game begins immediately, and Amit reaches out of the ground. If you remember, Amit is the same beast that destroyed the soul of the museum curator after he failed Shadi's test. Amit grasps onto Yugi's arms, and Shadi explains that the only way that Yugi will be able to escape him is if he wins the next game. Whereas if he loses the next game, the same thing that happened to the museum curator will happen to him. This entire game with Shadi is just another form of the weighing. He's just weighing Yugi's worth in a different way. They play a sort of matching game, but with an uneven number of panels, 9 in total. Yugi has to figure out which of Amit's features are mirrored and which ones aren't, in order to determine which feature of Amit is featured on the 9th panel. This is the most visually distinct and interesting of these games, at least in my opinion. So this is the one that always sticks out to me the most. When I think of these chapters, this is the game that I envision. And I'm not too humble to admit that I figured this one out a lot earlier than Yugi did. Amit has a lot of mirrored features. He has 2 hands, he has 2 eyes, he has 2 ears, but he only has 1 mouth. It's actually really clever because Amit's mouth is the thing that's about to bite Yugi's, I guess, soul's head off. So it's kind of like hiding the answer in plain sight. It's really neat. But once again, Yugi does get it, and the illusion of Amit disappears, and he and Shadi move on to the final stage. Meanwhile, Jinochi is still running for Professor Yoshimori. He's kind of been pratfalling his way around the building in the background of the comic as a little bit of comedy relief, but things get really harrowing when he's almost knocked out of a window. However, this does give him a view of Anzu, and so now Jinochi is going to try independently to get her down. We get another recap. Yugi has 3 Shabti left, one of which is already starting to crack. Meanwhile, Shadi hasn't taken any damage to his Shabti at all. Yugi has been unable to find a weakness in Shadi to exploit. Meanwhile, Shadi has pinpointed Yugi's biggest weakness: his friends. He creates an illusory pit and an illusory Jinochi, using the Millennium Puzzle as a kind of dice to determine in which direction the thrower's opponent will move. Yugi and the illusory Jinochi are to take turns throwing the Millennium Puzzle, ideally forcing their opponent to move in one direction so many times that they fall off the pit and die. Even though it's obvious that this is an illusion of Jinochi taken from the memories of Yugi's time before Jinochi was his friend, Yugi refuses to fight his friend at all. He allows Jinochi to take multiple turns, willing to walk off the pit if that's what it means. It seems like this really is Yugi's biggest weakness. When he saw the illusory Jinochi, 2 of his Shabti shattered immediately. But it's proven that this is actually Yugi's greatest strength when he declares to Shadi that despite everything, he trusts his friend with his life. Yugi, the original Yugi, not this Yugi, but both Yugis, I guess, in this instance, have always believed that Jinochi was a good person, even at the point in his life that this memory was taken from. And so in the last moments of the game, even the illusory Jinochi remembers that and disappears. Finally, the other Yugi has managed to do what he always does. Regardless of the game he's playing, regardless of the rules of that game, he always feels in control. And throughout this entire game, it's been different. He hasn't felt that way. It's been very clear to us as the audience that he hasn't been in control of this fight. Here, he takes control. Through his ironclad belief in himself and his bonds with his friends, he is able to defeat Shadi at his own game in spite of Shadi's rules. And in return for Yugi's trust, when the final rope holding Anzu up starts to fray and break, that's when Jinochi reaches her, standing on a ledge of the building beneath her and holding her up. Seeing how strong the bonds between these people are, how effortlessly, how flawlessly they support each other, covering each other's weaknesses, Shadi's Shabti finally starts to crack. This is when Yugi, unknowingly at this point, actually declares the power of the Millennium Puzzle. He announces that true strength can't be gained alone, that the power to trust your friends is the heart's true strength, that he derives the true strength in his heart from trusting in his friends. Shadi, who has been portrayed up to this point as someone who's kind of cynical-minded, who can't really believe in anyone without having literally tested their heart, is struck by this so hard that his Shabti shatters completely, the Millennium Key slides down the rope to Anzu, and she's returned to normal. She almost falls, but the other Yugi manages to catch her at the last moment and finally they meet face to face. They use the key to return Professor Yoshimori to normal as well. Yugi's grandpa, who was knocked out earlier, is revealed to be perfectly fine, and the other Yugi and Shadi have one final conversation. He talks about how he effectively lives in a world of illusions. He uses illusions to test people all the time, and yet the trust that Yugi showed in his friends felt like an illusion to him, even though it was real. It's such a poignant way of saying that this character doesn't have bonds like that in his real life, and that it makes him weaker as a person. It's during this conversation that the Millennium Puzzle's true power is finally spoken of. Yugi has realized what it is, that it brings people together just like the pieces in a puzzle. He calls it the power of unity, which surprises Shadi. I'll talk about that in a second. We get a nice splash page of him standing with all of his friends, which is pretty freaking cool. Shadi leaves, but he leaves with a parting word, that his bloodline has been looking for someone like the other Yugi. He mentions a door that needs to be opened that the other Yugi might be able to open. There's a bit of a wind down, and then the chapter ends. In the very end of this collection of chapters, we can see what is sort of the building blocks, the foundation for what will eventually become the endgame of Yu-Gi-Oh! But again, there are just so many things that contradict Shadi's later characterization. Suggesting that he didn't have any real bonds with anyone at this point is absolutely ridiculous based on what we see in the Dark Side of Dimensions movie. There we see that at this point in his life, Shadi was bringing together a bunch of orphaned and or disenfranchised children to give them a second life. That he had a sort of familial relationship with these children, and based on the timeline, there is no way that he wasn't already doing that at this point in time. So at the very least, he should have had real bonds with them. There's also the issue that Shadi should still know who the other Yugi is. Especially if he's talking about the door that I think he's talking about, and he thinks the other Yugi can open it. It's a bad retcon. The stuff that comes later is a bad retcon of this. I still love Yu-Gi-Oh! I still love the story of it, but it's just not good. It's obvious at this point that the other Yugi was still supposed to be some other half of Yugi and not a separate person. And while I do understand knowing the ending to the series that we eventually get, why it was changed, it's still a bad change from the perspective that it invalidates a lot of what made these Shadi chapters really interesting. So all of the intrigue that was built up in these chapters just doesn't go anywhere and ends up leaving you feeling disappointed. The saving grace of these chapters is that Shadi is still an interesting character, and his game with the other Yugi is still very interesting. It's visually dynamic, it's well designed, there's a lot of great suspense, and despite it being run-of-the-mill power of friendship stuff, Yugi's declarations in that final chapter of how his bonds with his friends make him strong are genuinely powerful. At the end of the day, this entire Shadi arc ends up being both good and bad. I guess while it fails in building up specific intrigue, it does manage to build up general intrigue, because now we know that there are other Millennium items out there, that they come in all different shapes with all different powers, and this does get us interested in seeing more of them and what they can do. By the end of the series, we do get to see all of them, and they follow the example set in this chapter of each time being a very special occasion. Still, I do look back on these chapters fondly. I do enjoy rereading them. It's kind of a bummer that I have to turn off my analytical mind when I do so as not to feel disappointed, but hey, what are you going to do? All of that said though, guys, if you have read these chapters of Yu-Gi-Oh!, let's get a discussion about them going in the comment section down below. Either way, this has been AJ22, and I will talk to you guys later.